So that was the vice presidential debate. You heard it here live and in full here on LBC News. I'm John Stratford, and here with me in the studio is James Goodison. James, just give us your assessment of what we've just seen over the last 90 minutes.
Well, it was night and day in comparison to last week, John. A lot of policy discussed for the first time. I think the key notes from it was Kamala Harris's really strong attack on the record of the president and Mike Pence regarding coronavirus, calling it one of the greatest failures ever, probably one of the top lines. But really, I think the story of this debate is, whilst there was a lot of policy discussed, there were several ducked questions by both candidates, whether it be Mike Pence ducking questions around climate change, Senator Harris ducking questions about whether or not Joe Biden and her would pack the Supreme Court with more judges. But perhaps most concerning of all, John, is the fact that both candidates ducked questions about the fact that both of their bosses are in their 70s and there's a global pandemic which targets people who are quite old. Something that needs to be pressed over the next few days for sure.
I'm sure we will hear more about that, and there will be more questions asked. We're joined on the line by Trevor McCrisken, Associate Professor of American Politics at the University of Warwick. Thanks for joining us here on LBC News this morning. You've stayed up to watch the debate tonight. What was your assessment?
Well, I think, as has just been suggested, it was night and day to last week. It was certainly, for your listeners, they would have actually been able to hear what everybody was saying, because there was a lot less interrupting going on. And we did get much more focus on policy than we did in that presidential debate last week. And so I think, anyone who was undecided about which of the two tickets to support, whether to support the Biden-Harris ticket or the Trump-Pence ticket, may have more of an idea of what their policy positions are from that VP debate than they did from the presidential debate a week ago. So in that respect, I think it was probably a positive thing. It was far less of a spectacle, I suppose, than last week's was, but there was definitely more substance on show tonight.
The thing I took away early on, Kamala Harris did seem to use, and obviously we were looking at the pictures here, but she did seem to use the camera a lot and look directly down the barrel of the camera as if reaching out to the voters watching. I think Mike Pence did a bit of that towards the end. I think he perhaps realised what she was doing, but that was a very deliberate thing, it felt.
It was, and Joe Biden had done the same thing very effectively last week in that presidential debate as well, and so Kamala Harris was following that, and she was very personable, I think, in the way that she talked directly to the camera. But I think you're also right that Mike Pence had kind of learnt something from last week, because we didn't see Donald Trump look at the camera, I don't think once, actually, in that debate last week. He was so busy sort of throwing insults to his opponent and to the moderator as well, that he really didn't address very much of what he was saying directly to the American people and looking into the camera. Mike Pence did that a lot more, and I think actually one of the takeaways from tonight is that Pence came across as much more professional than his boss, and much more presidential in some ways than Donald Trump was. I mean, he was always very supportive of Trump and suggesting that, what Donald Trump has been doing for America has been very positive, and that we need to give him 4 more years in order to fully accomplish what he set out to do. But in terms of the calm way in which he was answering questions, he did come across, I think, a lot better than Donald Trump had a week ago. Both of the candidates, though, the vice presidential candidates tonight, as you suggested just now, were avoiding questions quite often. And I was a little disappointed, actually, that the moderator didn't call them up on that at all. I mean, she was trying to move them on sometimes when they were talking for too long, and did try to aid them in terms of not interrupting each other. But not once, I think, did she say, well, thank you very much, but you've not answered my question. And as you suggested on the health of the president, and indeed the candidacy of Joe Biden, that both of those individuals, the VP candidates, were asked very directly, do you have a plan if, Biden or Trump, if they're president, are taken ill, if they're disabled in some way, will there be an agreement in place for you to take over as acting president? And of course, ultimately they could become the president during that next term. And neither of them answers the question. And I think especially given what's happened to Trump over the last few days and may continue to happen over the coming days, it really does leave a big question hanging in the air as to how well prepared either of these vice presidential candidates might be to take over should they have to. And that's obviously, would be something that could come to pass quite easily.
Yeah, indeed. And Trevor, I just wanted your opinion on in regards to how you think that people watching this debate who perhaps haven't made up their minds, although I doubt that there's that many in the States, how do you think that they've viewed the candidates, and what do you think they've taken away from both of these performances?
Well, again, I think for undecided candidates tonight, it's not going to be this debate that will decide things for them. They're going to want to see what happens over the next, it's 4 weeks now, isn't it? Just under 4 weeks until the actual election. It's probably about 10% of Americans, we think, or potential voters who have not 100% committed which way they're going to vote. They're unlikely to be led one way or the other by the vice presidential candidates. They're obviously going to be voting ultimately for the president. But of course, tonight's debate maybe is more important in terms of the likelihood of either of these candidates ending up being president in the long run, even if that's just 4 years from now when they run the next time around. But I think what they will have discerned from tonight, as I suggested, is more of the policy detail on COVID-19, on economic policy, climate change, the Affordable Health Care Act, even on foreign policy towards China, the Supreme Court pick that's being decided over the next few days, possibly, and on the big issue of racial justice as well. We had a lot of debate between the two, and the differences between the two tickets were plain and much plainer than they had been a week ago. And so that may well, if there's one of those issues that the undecided voter is the most interested in, what they heard tonight as being the position being taken by Biden-Harris or by Trump-Pence might well tip them one way or the other. But I think they'll be looking ahead to the next couple of weeks, and if those next two presidential debates do take place, then I think that the content of those, if they are able to be more policy-oriented than last week's encounter was, that's where the real difference could be made either way.
And Trevor, I just wanted to ask what you thought of the moderator's performance today. Susan Page, of course, the USA Today's Washington bureau chief. It seemed to me that obviously she had, I think, fair to say, an easier task than Chris Wallace did in the first presidential debate. But one thing that we've talked about that's sort of seemed to dominate the reaction is that there are a lot of dodged questions. Should she have pushed harder, or do you think it's just part of the culture around presidential debates that when you get asked a question, there's no sort of follow-up or pushing that we might have seen from a moderator here in Britain?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because they have very limited time. And so there's only an hour and a half. It has to be the 90 minutes. They can't overrun by too much because that's, as she pointed out at one point, the rules that have been agreed by the two sides. And so there is a limited amount of time to ask all of the questions that she has to get through. And so I think maybe that was part of the reason why, on occasion it felt very odd that she wasn't coming back to either Mike Pence or Kamala Harris and saying, well, really didn't answer my question. Neither of you, in fact, have answered this particular question that I've asked, and then gave them further opportunity. Instead, she moved on to the next question. So I think that was a bit disappointing as a viewer, at least, or as a listener, that some of those points weren't pressed home a bit harder. But I think that's probably because of the nature of the beast, really, that she had to move on to the next question. And she wasn't really helped in that respect by the fact that both of the candidates did keep overrunning their time as well. Even when they weren't answering the question that had been asked, they always had something to say, and they had points obviously that they sort of prepared beforehand that they wanted to get across, and so even pressing harder may not have got to the heart of the questions that were being asked. But just as Donald Trump was accused of ducking some very controversial questions a week ago, I think the same did happen tonight. But then I suppose that's fairly normal for these sorts of events.
Yeah, the thing that I think I'm going to take away from this tonight is Kamala Harris going, "No, I'm talking, Mr. Vice President. No, I'm talking."
Yeah, and that actually I think is very, very significant for a female vice presidential candidate and a black American as well, to be in that position of being interrupted and talked over. there will be millions of women around America going, that's exactly what happens to me all the time. And I love the way that she's responded to that. So I think that will have played very well, actually, particularly if there are undecided female voters who might think, you know what, I quite like the way that she's handled that. And that was very, she did it in a kind of a respectful but firm way. And, made it very clear that she was speaking and she should be listened to. And I think she was very effective. And I think if the Democratic Party is sort of looking ahead of itself now at who the next presidential candidate might be, she's obviously in a very good position to sort of take up that role. And I think also on some of the issues, she really did come across exceptionally well. Perhaps not surprisingly on racial justice, which is obviously something that she's worked very hard to try to achieve over her whole career. I thought she was incredibly effective on that front, but also on the law enforcement issues, and she was sort of at times there. I thought Pence was trying to bait her on that front, but she remained calm, played out her record, showed that she had great experience on that front, and again, I think came across very strongly in that respect. So it was a good performance, I think. But then I think on the other hand, the Trump-Pence supporters will think that he did a great job as well. As is often the case, the majority of the people that watch these events have already decided who they're going to vote for, and it just reinforces those positions. There certainly weren't any major howlers tonight, I think, that would have put anybody off, which we have seen in some vice presidential debates in the past. We didn't get any of that tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And Trevor, just finally, what do you think the main takeaways are going to be for both camps after this debate?
I think it's really that they need to reinforce some of the positions that have been set out tonight on those policy areas. I think particularly around COVID-19, because that is obviously the single most important issue that most Americans are facing at the moment, and it has knock-on effects for almost everything else that was talked about tonight. So I think that's going to be pretty significant to try and for both sides to really map out what the difference is between them, and particularly for the Biden-Harris ticket, what could they do that would be different come January to try to resolve the current crisis? And I think across those other issues, again, there are lots of positions that were, began to be laid out tonight where there might still be questions around the degree to which the sort of Biden-Harris ticket accepts some of the positions that are taken within the United States Congress by other Democrat main leaders of the Democratic Party and up-and-coming figures within the sort of left wing of the party, and how much of their agenda is being adopted by this ticket and how much is more sort of being aimed at the centrist part of the party, because there are these internal battles within each party, I think, that need to be worked out to some degree ahead of November 3rd.
Trevor McCrisken, Associate Professor of American Politics at the University of Warwick, thank you so much for your assessment this morning. We haven't actually mentioned the third participant in the debate tonight. There was a fly.
There was. I noticed that. I almost tweeted about that, actually. I thought that was brilliant. A fly landed on Mike Pence's head. And it sat there, didn't it, for quite some time on his hair. And he wasn't flustered in any way. Just at some point it disappeared. But that was quite entertaining.
I think that's the thing that a lot of people may take away from tonight. Yeah.
Joe Biden's just tweeted a website, flywillvote.com, which redirects to his website that gets people down to the polls as well. So opportunistic.
Brilliant. Trevor McCrisken, as I say, Associate Professor of American Politics at the University of Warwick, thank you so much for your assessment of that debate this morning. We are reflecting on the US vice presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence, which has taken place in Salt Lake City in Utah this evening. More analysis on the way.
The US presidential debates on LBC News.